To speak to these subjects and more, I think, we have two very distinguished experts, both men of prodigious parts, Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar from Pakistan and Dr. Nimal Sanderatne from Sri Lanka. Aasim, shall we start with you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to Professor Chowdhury and to ISAS for having me here again. When I sent the organizers of the conference the topic of what I want to speak about, I got the sense, similar to just based on what the introduction that was just given as well, that I would sort of be adding significant value to the deliberations, because just about everybody else would be speaking about the issues of land acquisition in rural areas. But I was pleasantly surprised, both a little bit yesterday and more so this morning, that there has been discussion of what's been going on in the urban context. Even though the suggestion is that most of what's been going on in India, at least, particularly what precipitated the reformulated 2013 Act, was this sort of outcry that policies were explicitly anti-farmer. So what I want to suggest is that perhaps when we look at the urban setting and the city in particular, and the modes of and the methods of development of the city and the usage of land within the city, there's something seriously amiss there as well, which without addressing, we cannot really get to the bottom of how to deal with what everybody's called the land problem. Yesterday, Mr. Panna from Orissa mentioned that real estate is the single biggest den of corruption in India. I think he called it, which he said takes some doing. He's right, it does take some doing to be considered the single biggest source or den of corruption. So it's with this in mind that I want to share with you some impressions on a burgeoning real estate market in urban Pakistan, okay, and particularly a bunch of housing schemes based in and around the twin cities of Islamabad and Rawalpindi. And my focus is specifically on housing rather than commercial real estate, which would be a separate discussion entirely. And more specifically on the dark underside of this housing market, which unfolds long before the luxurious gated communities that tantalize the middle class actually come into being. So this speaks to, as I sort of suggested earlier in the question-answer session, the earlier session, this speaks to my concern about the larger process for which land is typically acquired, namely development, which you will remember, I remember yesterday Professor Sarkar mentioned, has a rather checkered history. And Marx called it primitive accumulation, you'll remember. Of course, he was referring to a process that was the stage of history pre-capitalist. But recent formulations, for example, Partha Chatterjee, David Harvey, have all very clearly established that what is primitive accumulation, or what Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, is very much a contemporary phase of capitalist development. It's not something that's done and dusted, and we've all moved on to more civilized, so to speak, forms of development. And then the specific question that I want to ask in terms of developing the city is, a la the French thinker and social theorist of space, Henri Lefebvre, is who enjoys the right to the city, which is not a taken for granted fact. There is a question of different sort of segments of the population enjoying or not, as the case may be, differential rights to the city and its development. Okay, so let me start by noting some features of the wider structural environment, which various speakers have already hinted at over the last couple of days, and two interrelated sort of what I would call secular trends over the last few decades. The first is what has been called financialization of the global economy at large, okay, a process that has intensified steadily since the 1970s. By this is meant simply a shift away from real production as a means of generating wealth towards speculative finance as the dominant source of wealth generation. So most often we think of financialization as being based around stocks, derivatives, but a burgeoning real estate market is also a big part of this process of financialization. In any case, this process at large is a phenomenon that has led to a greater concentration of wealth and power in metropolitan centers than at any other time in human history. And we're talking the last just 30 or 40 years. So the second major secular trend of these past few decades is, again, something that people have already mentioned, is rapid urbanization. So there can be disagreement on the exact figures, but it's more or less, we would probably agree that South Asia is amongst, if not the fastest, urbanizing regions of the world. In Pakistan, some demographers and sociologists actually argue that half of the population already lives in what is effectively an urban environment, even if official statisticians continue to depict the majority of the population as rural. And I've got this sense yesterday as well that there was, we didn't debate it as such, but this sense that, well, 65 to 70% of the population still derives its income from farming, I think is a bit misleading. In particular, that's because a lot of those, what would otherwise be considered perhaps in some kind of official statistics, farming households, if you disaggregate that prototypical rural household, you'll find a lot of its members engaged in non-agricultural sectors and deriving income from even within that particular setting. And then the more important, I think, phenomenon is the large number of working age males that have migrated to cities, both home and abroad. And that, I think, is increasingly the rule rather than the exception. In Pakistan's case, it varies from region to region. So Punjab and Pakhtunkhwa will have a much higher proportion of working age males migrating to urban areas than, let's say, Sindh or Balochistan, but nevertheless the overall trend is in the same direction. So in any case, urban sprawl on the back of continuous flows of surplus labor from rural areas, as far as I see it, has taken on quite epic proportions, which sort of mentioned briefly or hinted at it in the previous session as well. And so when we get to the other side of both of these secular trends is basically ever expanding urban centers, populated largely, however, by the working poor. That also seems to me to be a relatively self-evident fact. Again, there may be differences in proportions, but the larger segment of this urban environment is populated by those on the low-income side. So then the question is, what's the form of development, and particularly housing, taking place in these urban centers? So my empirical focus in this particular paper is on a series of housing schemes that have proliferated over the past 2 decades, in the first instance known as defense housing authorities. Those of you in Pakistan or from Pakistan will know of them very well, might even have been fortunate enough to get a plot in a DHA. And more recently, in another manifestation as the Beria housing schemes. Now, those of you, again, with a vague familiarity of the Pakistani context or know that they are now arguably, both of these schemes, for example, amongst others, are the most sought-after housing option for the aspiring middle class. The names, of course, come from the military. The defense housing scheme is self-evident. Beria means navy. And it is also now a generally well-accepted fact that Pakistani military personnel have developed over the years of what is a vast corporate empire. And real estate development is, I would argue, the crown jewel in this empire. What on paper are highly subsidized, in the first instance, what are on paper highly subsidized land allotments made to military personnel for their, so to speak, sacrifices to defending the country, metamorphose those regularly into full-on housing schemes in which the original allottees often sell off their plots to private owners after developing them, earning exponential returns on their original investment. The other related benefit to military personnel is that once they retire from professional service, they usually get immediately hired in these defense housing authorities and Beria schemes, not to mention the plethora of other military-run corporate initiatives, from fertilizer to cereal to travel agencies. You can take your pick. Now, this is the backdrop to my particular story. Doesn't constitute the sum total of the story. What I want to focus on is the manner in which the land that comes to constitute these various housing schemes is actually acquired. Right? Depending on, in this particular case, the case that I'm interested in, Beria town, Rawalpindi, which has exploded onto the cityscape over the last 10 years. So about 15 years ago, it didn't exist. And now it's this big, huge gated community spread out over about 300 acres in sort of along the highway that adjoins Rawalpindi and Islamabad, on both sides of the highway. So the mastermind of the Beria project has emerged rapidly as the poster child of the gated community revolution, and one of the richest men in Pakistan. Started off as a small-time housing contractor in the 1980s. His name is Malik Riaz, and he's developed quite a reputation, not least of all for knowing and kowtowing with both civilian and military elites. The Beria management itself is filled to the brim with retired military personnel. Even though the institution itself, in a number of court cases, which I'll discuss subsequently, has actually distanced itself from the scheme, but not enough to suggest that the scheme should change its name, mind you. So of particular significance for this paper is the manner in which the almost 300 acres on which the Beria town is built was acquired. In the Rawalpindi area, there's a well-known family of political strongmen called the Khokars. And with the Khokars providing basically the thugs and the goons, the Beria town management coerced 200 or so families owning an average of about 10 canals of land. 8 canals is an acre. Were often intimidated into selling their land at rates that were well below the open market price, and of course far lower than what the price of land would reach only a year or so later once the housing scheme was announced. And mind you, these housing schemes are interesting because long before they actually are delivered, the application for the housing scheme actually sells on the black market. Nowadays, an application form for, let's say, a Beria town plot, its going rate is anything from 1.5 to 2 lakhs. Just the application form, let alone the plot, once the plot is actually delivered. I was present at some of the open meetings in around 2002, 2003 of the original residents in which they resolved to resist the forced sale of their lands. And there was a great deal of, we will never let this happen. But a combination of violence, intimidation, and the filing of police cases with the assistance of the local Thanadars put paid to this resolve rather quickly. And efforts to then subsequently to raise what was quite scandalous and blatantly illegal process of forced land acquisition in the media were also futile. Later on, we discovered that Malik Riaz actually owns 3 of the newspapers that we tried to file the newspaper stories in. And importantly, most importantly, there were also supporters at the highest levels of government. And remember, this is Pervez Musharraf's military regime is in power at this time. A number of litigations filed in local and the Lahore High Court remain pending till this day. And lawsuits against Beria Town and the Defense Housing Authority have actually come to light in recent times in the Supreme Court, but there has been as yet no criminal proceedings against the management of either entity. So the one thing I want to clarify here is the Land Acquisition Act, which in contrast to India, in Pakistan remains frozen in time in 1894. did not even need to be invoked to undertake this process of forced displacement. So we dispensed with the niceties of laws entirely. Now, land allotments, for example, in rural areas to military personnel in return for their services are often undertaken with some sort of, even if sort of passing reference to land acquisition. In those cases, what happens is the Ministry of Defense writes a letter to the provincial government and says, we have this many Jawans who have made these many sacrifices for the country, so give us 1,000 acres of land. So in that case, there is some, at least on the surface, some due process. In this case, which are formally privately run housing schemes, no such process is required. Literally, it's coercive force and intimidation that is sort of the order of the day. Now, subsequent housing schemes, of course, may have, with the prices of land having shot up in the subsequent, let's say, decade, may not have featured such strong-arm tactics because, rapidly increasing land prices means that, original owners might be willing to sell out. Which is why I want to then suggest the other part of this story, which is important. So the gated communities that are advertised by the private real estate developer appeals greatly to the middle class, but it means nothing to the majority of the city's residents who simply can't afford such a plot. So for example, the smallest plot in Beria town, 5 marlas, so 1 canal is 20 marlas, so 5 marlas, which is probably maybe about 90 square yards, costs a minimum of 28 lakhs. So you can forget that the majority of the city's population is going to be able to afford this. Now, this is a problem. Islamabad, for example, in the 98 census had a population of 800,000, and it is now anything from 1.8 million to 2.5 million. Okay, this is a threefold increase in about 17 years. And the majority of these migrants are low-income sort of people who are pushed out due to lack of employment in rural areas who come into urban areas as a result. And there's no one catering to their housing. Islamabad's Capital Development Authority, the city's sort of development agency, itself acknowledges that at least 200 housing schemes have developed over the last 15 years. Mind you, on its website, it acknowledges that 108 of them are illegal, in complete violation of zoning regulations, and with no NOC, no objection certificate. But these schemes continue to proliferate. Nobody stopped them. In contrast, and this goes back to what was mentioned yesterday about encroachments in one of the sessions yesterday. In contrast, over the last 7 to 8 years, the CDA, the Capital Development Authority, has launched a quite ruthless eviction operation against squatters. So the formal housing the market and the state refuse to provide housing. So the state, for example, the CDA, claims that it has low-income sectors, but in those low-income sectors, it only allots 5% of those plots to people who can privately come and acquire them. Most of those plots are allotted to either government employees or in private auctions. So 5% of the plots in low-income sectors, my calculations, let's say 30,000 plots, 5% of those is 1,500 for a population of at least 7 to 8 lakhs in the last 15 years. Right? So this is sort of the model of development that we're dealing with. And so this is what I want to suggest, this is where I started off with. So who has the right to the city? Clearly, the majority of its residents don't. And this then leads to the heart of this question of land. Sure, there is this question of as urbanization increases and sprawl increases, land will be utilized for both commercial and residential purposes. But on both accounts, I see the majority of the residents of this city being totally and completely disenfranchised. And the government then essentially is at the service of speculators who are going to, even the low-income plots, mind you, so a government plot, let alone a private plot, even if it is allotted to sort of low-income groups, is also subject to speculation on the black market. And it's usually, our estimate is the 5th or 6th owner after 5 or 6 sales, is the one who actually settles on the plot. By that time, the price is well in excess of what it was when it was originally allotted, and we can forget that the urban poor, the majority of the city's residents, have any claim to it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sajjad, for what was a very real, almost verging on the surreal, actually, analysis and account of the situation in Pakistan. Professor Nimal Sanderatne, senior agricultural economist from the Institute of Postgraduate Studies as in Agriculture, Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. I feel very privileged and honored to speak at this 10th annual conference of ISAS, and I'm very grateful to ISAS for inviting me, because I have been enriched by the presentations and the discussions we have had over the last 1.5 days. With respect to my presentation, I was under the impression, because I had prepared a 20-page paper, that you all may have access to it, but since it is not available to you, I thought I'll make a very brief summary of the main issues that I addressed in that paper. The theme of my paper was the interaction and the intertwining of political and economic factors in land policies in Sri Lanka. And I'll illustrate this with respect to 4 or 5 of the main land policies that the country has adopted. There's the large land settlement schemes in the country. Then the paddy land tenure reforms of the 1950s, the land reform of the 1970s, and the land acquisitions, which fall into 3 different categories. One is the land acquisitions of the state for public purposes and development projects, the land acquisitions by the LTT, more of land grabs during the ethnic conflict, and the land acquisitions by the army. In a sense, these 2 are probably somewhat unique in South Asia. With respect to land settlement schemes, let me go back to the historical background. In as far back as 1840, the British enacted what is called the Wastelands Ordinance, which placed all land not being occupied or with a legal title vested in the state. And that resulted in vast amount of land in the country belonging to the crown at that stage, or the state. It was an act which was followed by a rebellion in 1848, because this really deprived the peasants of the country their customary rights in land. But it was the same act that enabled the colonial government to sell large extents of land to British and Scottish planters for the development of the coffee estates at first, and then the tea and rubber estates. And some land was also sold to Sri Lankan entrepreneurs, mainly for the cultivation of coconut. Now, the significance of this is that the state owned large extents of land, and this was not only in the upcountry areas, the hill country, which was used to give the planters the land for their estates, but also land in other parts of the country. And even today, the state is the largest owner of land in the country, probably estimated at about 60–70% of the land area. Now, this is very relevant to the program of land settlement, which in Sri Lanka is known as the colonization schemes that were adopted beginning in 1927. Let me also, as background, tell you that in the case of Sri Lanka, the most important socio-economic change did not occur with independence. It preceded independence. Sri Lanka was given home rule in 1931 based on a constitution with universal suffrage. In fact, the British gave Sri Lanka universal franchise just 3 years after it had given its own citizens. And that was a profound change, because now the rulers were dependent on the votes of the entire population for their power. And so from 1931 onwards, there were these land settlement schemes that were adopted. Persons were given at first 5 acres of land, paddy land, and 3 acres of highland, and also financial subsidies to settle, to build their homes, and so forth. Now, though this scheme began in 1927, it gained momentum really after universal franchise. But there was one hindrance to its expansion to the extent that the government wished. The infrastructure in these dry zone areas in the north central province was inadequate, and while many of the infectious diseases in the country had been brought under control, there was a very, very large health hazard, and that was malaria. Because of the deterrent of malaria, there was a reluctance of some of these people to settle in these areas. But that was removed in 1945 when DDT was invented and malaria came under control, and the death rate was halved in one single year. And that has been described by the demographer Kingsley Davies as the amazing decline in mortality unprecedented anywhere else. Now, what all this meant was now the government had a political motivation to undertake these settlement schemes. The landed oligarchy that ruled in the pre-independence period and the decade after independence was committed to what is known as agricultural fundamentalism. They believed that a land-owning peasantry was the best protection for democracy and the best antidote for Marxism. In fact, the Marxist parties in Sri Lanka opposed land settlement schemes. These colonization schemes or land settlement schemes had this political motivation, but it also had an economic justification. And that justification lay in the fact that Sri Lanka was a food deficit country. In fact, at around the time of independence, we were importing about 60% of our rice requirement. So this was a means by which we are expanding the cultivation of paddy, and it's trying to achieve self-sufficiency. It was also the correct economic strategy, the land extensive strategy, because at this time the high-yielding technologies were not available. So you see in the land settlement schemes both political and economic motivations. And it was this large settlement schemes which has, by and large, together with the high-yielding technology that came in the 60s and 70s, that has made Sri Lanka now more or less food self-sufficient, and particularly self-sufficient in rice. The second piece of land policies that I want to focus on were the Paddy Lands Acts of 1950s, particularly the one in 58. Now that had political motivations as well as very rational economic justification. What the Paddy Lands Act did was to control rents on paddy lands in such a manner that it gave an incentive for farmers to adopt better technology, as they were the gainers of the yields above 1/4 of the produce, or 40 bushels per acre at that time. Unfortunately, this piece of legislation was embroiled in huge controversy from within the government itself. And the government split, and ultimately it was one of the reasons, the opposition to this act was one of the reasons for the assassination of the Prime Minister SWRD Bandaranaike in September 1959. There was a period of chaos after that, and the implementation of this act suffered seriously. It was largely unimplemented because there was wide-scale evictions, and remedial actions were very long drawn out. And the government's interest in the Act, implementation of the Act, dissipated. And so what was a very fine piece of legislation that would have transformed the agrarian structure of Sri Lanka was largely unimplemented. And here again you see the interplay of politics and economics. The third piece of legislation that I want to focus is on the land reforms of 1972 and 74. The 72 reform placed a ceiling on the extent of land that could be owned by an individual or family. It placed the limit as 50 acres, and in the case of paddy land, it limited it to 25 acres. Now, the motivation for this piece of legislation was entirely political, because at the 1970 election, the manifesto of the party that came into power did not have land reform as a piece of legislation that it espoused. It was really espoused as a response to the youth insurgency of 1971. It was believed that such an act would temper the youth and Marxist kind of opposition to the government. The 72-1 reform was followed in 74 by the taking over of the estates which were exempted under the previous act, because there was now agitation by Sri Lankan landowners that why should their land be taken when land belonging to the large estate companies were not. And so the land was taken over of the estates, and the state established several organizations. And of course, as you're all aware, the state is a very inefficient manager of business enterprises.
Professor, we're running out of time, so you might want to cut it a bit short.
Okay. So the result was that it was an economic disaster, and the same government that nationalized the estates, they went on to privatize them in 1996. Well, in the interest of time, I will leave there, and I'll take up probably the acquisitions part during question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very profound, of course. You have the 20-page that you have submitted, and I'm sure Professor Mitra will ensure that it sees the light of day in the form of an ISAS publication. It most certainly will. So Q&A time. Please identify yourself. We begin with Professor Mitra. Identify yourself. You might wish to line up behind the microphones if you like, or at any rate, show me your hands. Let me recognize you.
The whole idea behind this panel was to ask, how do we understand South Asia, which is in the title of this conference, in terms of the land problem? Is South Asia the name of a solution, or is it a context for the search of solutions? The two papers we have heard have persuaded me already that the latter is the answer, that there is no South Asian solution. South Asia is a context for the search. Now, if South Asia is a context, then how do we understand the context within South Asia, like Pakistan or Sri Lanka, as parameters? Is context all, or can we melt them down to some underlying parameters which will help in looking
whole set of new zamindars or landlords, because the earlier remnants of the Mughal feudals were unable to pay up the revenue that was fixed. And so the land passed on to their petty officials of these Mughal feudals, who in their own rights have now became landlords. That also led to, of course, because of the exploitation, led to several peasant upheavals in Bengal and also in Bihar. Pabna Rent Revolt, for instance, in the 1850s, the Indigo Riots, which were in some ways forerunner of Mr. Gandhi's passive non-violence resistance movements. And these led to the British enactment of the Tenancy Act of 1885, and that was in response to these peasant movements. Now, after partition in 1947, in East Bengal, which was the eastern wing of Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, the 1950 State Acquisition and Tenancy Act abolished zamindaris altogether. It wasn't difficult to do because the zamindars in East Bengal were mostly absentee landlords who lived in Calcutta. Because remember, they were the sort of the officials of the earlier Bengal Mughal time feudals. Now, as in physics, so in politics, perhaps in society, nature abhors vacuum. This vacuum was filled up by the new Bhadralok of East Bengal, commercial classes, entrenched interests, who were not any less rent-seeking than the zamindars. The state intervened from time to time to improve the quality of life and things for the peasants. The deputy commissioner has been from time to time empowered through various acts and legislations, but this did not entirely succeed in resolving the governance issues. In Pakistan, successive governments tried their hands in reforms. However, the old inherited power structures of the local aristocracies, the great Khans of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Chowdhurys of Punjab, and the Vaderas of Sindh remained. And indeed, the influence was perceptibly shifted also to urban settings, joined now by business interests and ex-bureaucrats, both civil and what Feiner, the historian Feiner, political scientist, described as the man on horseback, which is the military. It is unlikely that changes will come unless there is a buy-in from these ruling classes. In Sri Lanka, which was not a part of the Raj Imperium, the Crown Lands Empowerment Encroachment Ordinance of 1840 remained the mainstay, the most important land law, though it has been amended from time to time. Now, the disputations that we have read in the media recently about the Sampur special zone in Trincomalee, now rescinded by President Sirisena, that brings to mind the examples of Singur and Nandigram in India that we discussed at length yesterday.
In terms of the kinds of services that are available to you. So if there's an urban kind of life, if you have, for example, access to roads, you have access to sanitation, you have access. So for example, in Pakistan, the most urbanized belt is the one from starting from Rawalpindi all the way down to Multan. So the argument would be that villages on either side of the GT road are effectively to be classified as urban settlements, right? So that's sort of the expanded definition of urban, which pushes the population well above 50%. The question that Surya had about the militarization of everything, well, you know, I mean, this is sort of beyond the purview of our particular concern, but I think that as far as the military is concerned, I mean, the ideal situation for the Pakistani military is for its corporate interests and for the larger sort of political direction of the state to be what it wishes it to be without it actually having to be in power. So that saves it from facing the problem that incumbent governments face, whilst also being able to ensure that its interests are served, whether they be strategic or political, or in this case, corporate. And of course, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that those two things are not necessarily separate. So a lot of its political influence is directed towards protecting its corporate initiatives. And corporate means, you know, military-run companies. It also means the budget. You know, it means a whole host of different things. So if it can do that while staying out of power, that's the ideal situation. So now, for example, these days is the ideal situation, right? Where King Rahil is traveling the world as the de facto head of state, but not actually in government. So he gets all of the good things said about him, while the politicians are cussed out for being corrupt and inefficient and inept. So that's the ideal situation. But as we know, as from the past, every once in a while, the ideal situation descends into some kind of conflict, and that's when military coups happen. In this particular case, the present government, I think, has actually retreated and relinquished policy space in the interests of staying nominally in power, which is to say they get their fair share of the tekas, while staying in power, while the military gets the lion's share. And if that was to change, and the elected government said, no, we will stand our position and we will not retreat, that's when I would suggest there would be some kind of instability and potentially some kind of coup. By the way, in Pakistan, it's common knowledge these days that it's effectively a soft coup has already happened. And, you know, for all intents and purposes. So, for example, someone was mentioning to me yesterday that Nawaz Sharif was just visiting Washington and meeting with Obama, and policymakers in Washington are like, who cares about Nawaz Sharif? When is Rahil Sharif showing up? You know, when is the real sort of decision maker actually coming to town? Which he's, by the way, coming to town in a week or so.
Well, all good things must end, so must this very, very fruitful discussion. I just wanted to add one point to the discussions. That's because I'm also filling in for Bangladesh. It's something that has not come up. It's the rules of inheritance, which sort of has an impact on land in rural areas in our countries, particularly as Bangladesh is a Muslim country, and the law of primogeniture does not apply. So land becomes fragmented as it sort of goes from one generation to another. So the state is also confronted with the issue of consolidation of land. And it is important that the state does it, because the state also has to ensure, and that's another exciting thing that the state has to do, is to allow for 16 ounces of rice at least per individual, which in our case would add up to 32 to 33 million tons. And if you add 1.5 million tons as buffer, you need to produce 35 million tons. So at all points in time, the state must ensure that the land that Bangladesh has is able to produce 35 million tons to feed its population. Well, might you say that, well, why don't you follow the WTO principle and, if you run short, go for things that you have advantages over and then procure from outside. But at times, whenever external procurement, times of crisis, external procurement becomes very difficult because crisis is usually global, and then you have sources like Thailand and India closing up. exports. So that's another problem that the state has to, the policymaker has to watch out for at all points in time. Okay, thank you very much. It was a very exciting, very illuminating discussion, and we would, I'd invite you to join your hands in thanking our very august speakers and the audience. It brings us to the end of the panel, and I'll let you go as soon as I have given you some token of affection on behalf of ISAS for you to take home.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Nimal Sanderatne. And Dr. Aasim Akhtar.